Hello and welcome back to another week of the War Report. Now we have quite the news lineup for you. Not as much as usual, but it's still a pretty interesting show we got ahead. Now, starting out, a favorite topic of ours, we covered this at length for about a month and a half last year. Actually, around this time last year is when we stopped talking about it, and then we, of course, had to pick it back up again in December. And for longtime viewers of the show, you should know that we're talking about the Khashoggi case. Now, there are reports out now that Jared Kushner gave the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman permission to arrest Khashoggi. And you actually told me about this, so I think I'll let you take the lead on this one.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know exactly how much stock to put in this, but there's somebody in intelligence who is claiming that Kushner gave the go-ahead to arrest Khashoggi. So, Kushner, in other words, is speaking with the royal family in Saudi Arabia, and that's where the order came from. Or at least the permission for it came from there. This makes the entire event, much more complicated and complex than we would have thought. Because, quite honestly, the way it was framed was, well, he was offed because he was criticizing Saudi Arabia, but he was also criticizing Assad, so therefore not that bad. I don't. To me, that's not a good enough reason. I don't know if we're ever going to find out what Khashoggi was up to. That the royal family felt it was necessary to kill him, or if you listen to the royal family, that a rogue element within the Saudi government felt it was necessary to kill him. I can't claim to know what what the media pressures are like in the Middle East and the perception that is projected on Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, but I don't see how that fault of Khashoggi is enough to kill him. But at the same time, I don't see why the House of Saud would feel it necessary to kill him. Now, he did have connections with Osama bin Laden. We all know that, stretching way back to the war in Afghanistan during the Soviet era. He got his first break from interviewing Osama bin Laden and, basically becoming friends with his family. So I don't know if that has anything tied to it. It's still early. I don't know if this story is going to be buried, but it is interesting.
Now,
It
to
is
further complicate this story is from Press TV, which say they got it from the Spectator, the British magazine, who said they got it from investigators on the U.S. House Intelligence Committee, who were claiming this, and this all leads back to the whistleblower debacle, which leads into the impeachment debacle, which I'm not even going to get into this week, but just layer upon layer of complications.
Right, right. Yeah. So, it's just something to keep in mind. I don't discredit Press TV. Uh, I certainly don't think they're, a lesser outfit than CNN or Fox News. There might be a kernel of truth, and if there is, then maybe it will get buried. We don't know, or it might definitely be something that will resurface as the impeachment trial begins. So, almost on cue, Western liberals were heartbroken that this guy they never knew was killed by Erdogan. Oh no, not by Erdogan, but by the Saudis, and maybe Erdogan was there in a chair with a cigar, just watching him get dismembered. Who knows?
Twirling his mustache.
Yeah, yes. So I don't. I mean, it's just something to think about as the impeachment trial starts to ramp up. If my guess is this might be revisited, very, very soon in the new year, um, or maybe even around Christmas, if it has any legs. But there's still a potential it's going to come out in 2020.
Oh no, just expect everything we've talked about for the entire existence of the show, and going back to the beginning, to the Trump campaign, to come out. We'll hear about the Russian woman who was supposedly spying on the NRA. We'll hear about Mike Flynn. We'll hear about everything. We'll hear about. I imagine
Yes.
Tillerson will probably come up, and he'll probably throw Trump under the bus because, as famously known, they do not have a good relationship, especially since his dismissal. But expect everything from the past 3, 4 years to come up in the new year, and I'm gonna say this: it'll definitely be interesting to have them put together their timeline, their point of view of events that we've been documenting ourselves, and see how absolutely diluted it is. And that's probably the only positive that will come out of this.
Mm. Right. So yeah, I just thought that might be something interesting.
Now, moving on from that, of course, there's some news about Iran that does not involve oil tankers for the first time in several months. Now, Iran has not been satisfied with the remaining JCPOA partners, and mainly the ones in the West, France, Germany, etc. Of course, they're on better terms with Russia and China. Not that they're best of friends, but we've discussed that. We've gone into that before, but that's beside the point. And they are lessening. They are quote lessening their commitments to the agreement. And as of November 6th, so yesterday on Wednesday, Iran temporarily
Mhm.
detained nuclear inspectors according to a report from the Hill. Now, I'm not sure how inclined I am to believe this. Of course, the Hill works around Capitol Hill as one of the
Mhm.
more biased media outlets, more biased pro-establishment media outlets, but they still put out a lot of stories. So, there's your ups and downs. But
Right.
if they did, it was probably nothing more than the standard procedure. Them digging into your background, them applying a heavy security measure that they do to outsiders. You talk to anyone who's been to Iran. Of course, they're very insular society. No surprise. The last 40 years of isolation will do that to you, believe it or not. But I'm not sure whether or not this came out to try to drum up more outrage against Iran because it has admittedly died down since the debacle in Syria and especially the Kurds and Erdogan. How Turkey has sort of become the new boogeyman to the Washington establishment that we must take on Turkey. We must stop Erdogan in his tracks. Whereas Iran and their sponsor of terror and their hijacking oil tankers and their plans to destroy Israel have sort of taken a backseat, even amongst the Republicans in Congress and the Republicans in government in general.
Right. And I mean, Iran has always been a bit of a hard sell, almost as hard as North Korea. That is, these allegations are thrown at them. And, I mean, looked at it from a slightly different perspective, you could see perhaps why some would think that, the greatest sponsor of terror ever. Well, I mean, they're funding Hezbollah and
They're funding both Al Qaeda and Assad at the same time in Syria.
okay. I mean, that's patently ridiculous. But I mean that, Iran acts as a perpetual boogeyman the way North Korea does, right? Um, these are two countries that managed to continue to survive and trot on. And, despite all the isolation and despite, all the sanctions placed on them, they still managed to stay in their position and quite admirably so, given the circumstances. But whenever it's necessary, they'll be drummed up. Suddenly they'll become the most important topic in geopolitics and on the 6 o'clock news. You'll just have to tune in the spring, and you'll see that North Korea will be back in the news.
Well, they'll
North
find
Korea
more
will be
footage from a Kentucky gun range and pawn it off as being from North Korea or Iran.
right, right. So you know, that's just geopolitics. That's just a strategy. It's an area where America wants a lot of dominance and, you know, can't get it or it's compromised. I mean, North Korea just does, you know, basically it's extortion. It just threatens South Korea. South Korea gives money. Probably half of it is just out of pity. That, you know, there's still families that are divided, and maybe the other part is that they are afraid that they might do something crazy. But you know, even South Korea at some point realizes that, you know, this is just an extortion racket, and it's not. But they're not seriously going to nuke Seoul. And I think in some ways, a lot of people feel that way about Iran. Iran isn't going to nuke Jerusalem. They're not going to like nuke Israel and, you know, kill like 7 million Muslims and destroy the Al Aqsa Mosque, you know, just to own the Jews.
Yeah,
It's
and
not going to happen.
the big difference between Iran and North Korea in that regard is a good 25% of the American population buys into the evangelical eschatology about Israel and the end times and
Yeah.
how Iran is going to usher in the war to end all wars before the second coming. So there's a bit of a, I would say, pseudo religious element to it that makes it a bit different, that makes especially Americans a lot more concerned about it. But beyond that, something else to watch out for with Iran is I believe we're nearing the end of the arms embargo that was actually imposed right after the revolution in 1979. Now, there's been talks that Iran is going to buy S-300. They're going to buy the S-400 from Russia. There's been, of course, several meetings between Rouhani and Putin and Russian and Iranian officials over the past few years. And as the arms embargo expires, we're probably going to see Iran make some solid arms deals with either Russia or China or both. And I would say that would solidify things, and that may be a reason they're backing off the deal because they'll feel less reliant on the West as things fully open between them, Russia, and China.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Um, yeah. I mean, in some ways, a lot of the reasons I think that uh, other reasons why I think, you know, Iran isn't in the news is because um, you know, a lot of uh, you know, what was supposed to happen with all the conflicts that took place in the summer, in a sense, I don't want to say they've been resolved, but, you know, a limit has been reached.
They've been pacified.
Uh, yeah, yes, and so you know, and Trump was not willing to go to war. If we believe that, you know, war was with Iran was an inevitability, I personally don't think it was. Um, you know, that doesn't mean that certain neocons and war hawks didn't want it to happen, um, but I don't think that's a possibility. I don't think America wants to do that, and it's not like all they have to do is kill the president and everything will change. You know, it was even a harder nut. It was even harder of a nut to crack in Libya to just do that. So, so I doubt. Uh, you know, all things said, I think in some ways you know, the Arab states around the Persian Gulf as well as America have now, you know, a sort of a healthy respect of Iran. You know, um, you know, I think when you look at like their navy is like these basic speedboats, you know, and guys willing to die in the dozens just to bring down perhaps a carrier or a destroyer. Um, you could argue that America was just basically testing to see what they had and how far they were willing to go.
Yeah, that's actually a point you pointed out that the Gulf states and the West have gained a healthy respect for Iran after the summer skirmishes, we'll call them. And that's
Mhm.
actually a point that Colonel McGregor makes a lot, and he says outright that at some point Israel will have to sit down with Iran, the Gulf states will have to sit down with Iran, the United States will have to sit down with Iran, and Saudi Arabia, if you believe the reports, has actually gone through Oman in order to send something of a peace treaty, something of an offer of de-escalation, sort of a truce, to the Iranians to sort this out without it exploding into a regional war. Now, this report was from several months ago, and seeing as things have calmed down, I'm inclined to believe it's actually true.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of those Arab states have they've lost the steam to go after Iran, and you know it has to be mentioned that part of this has to deal with the unexpected victory that occurred in Syria. You know, you had countries like Qatar, for instance, that along with Saudi Arabia, America, and Israel, of course, were happy to fund these jihadists that were named freedom fighters and so on. And you know, something very huge, something very big happened. You know, the groundwork for a pipeline from Qatar into the Middle East was stopped, and it's that cannot be um, understated. And Iran was part of that. And I think you couple that with the way the war began to turn around, especially in 2016, soon after the Russians got involved, that the jig was up, right? And they've come around, and of course, we touched on this in another show that the Arab states also want to invite Syria back into its roundtable meetings. So I think that plays a pretty big role. The world has had to accept an outcome in Syria that it did not expect, and it did not expect it for years.
I mean, what we have here is the smart players cut their losses. Turkey
Yes.
being one of the prime examples where they were fully against Assad. Erdogan, Assad's famous Aleppo will be the graveyard of Erdogan's dreams. You had, of course, the Arab states, the Arab Gulf states, the Arab League, European Union, NATO, United States, all against them. And even it's gotten to the point where Israel has conceded defeat in Syria. When was the
Yeah.
last Israeli bombing of Syria? I can't even remember.
That's a very good point. It's been weeks,
It's been months.
months. Yeah. Yeah, it's been very and the last few have been very ineffectual. And presumably, they've stated that the reason they're doing this is they're going after um, high value Iranian military targets. These are advisors and officers. And we don't even hear about that. The Iranians are still there. They're not leaving. It's a victory, and they've had to accept Iran's resilience.
Actually, come to think of it, the last major piece of news I heard out of Israel on the world stage in relation to other countries and groups is their scuffle with Hezbollah that didn't end too well back in the summer.
Right. Yeah. I'd have to. I remember that, but I don't. I don't recall the details. It's all that well at the moment.
They had the drone, and then
Um,
they claimed that the one armored vehicle was actually drone controlled and
yeah.
had a
Oh,
dummy in
yeah.
it.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Yeah. Notice how like Israel's grown very quiet after that, and then they said it was filled with dummies, and they were just it was an enactment or a drill. It was ridiculous. No one believed it. Um, yeah, that was really quite incredible.
Yeah, beyond the regular Israel Gaza disputes, there hasn't been much. I know Gaza launched another rocket attack into Israel a couple days ago, but that's not really newsworthy. It happens again every few weeks. No major targets were hit. Most of the rockets were intercepted. Israel cried about how they were being oppressed. Hamas said, of course, from the river to the sea, and it was just the standard fare. Nothing really too
Yeah, yeah.
significant happened.
Listened to it for years now,
Yeah,
decades. In fact.
yeah. Well, I mean, especially since 2005, since Israel actually left Gaza. But moving on from that, we have news on Syria. So I'll pull up our map here. You won't be able to see it, but our audience will be. Now, for those of you in the audience, you'll be able to see in very far northwestern Syria, near the Turkish-Iraqi border, you'll see some oil fields that are in blue. So, of course, the United States has gone back, and I don't have the map on me, but there's a map of U.S. troop movements through Syria, how they go into Iraq and then loop back around, like into very northern Syria. And it looks completely incoherent. It looks like several different people are in charge of this, which in some cases that is true. Now, Syria has actually gained back some oil fields in northeastern Syria, so uh, despite the U.S. denying Syria oil, more or less it seems to be working out for them, and even the oil under Kurdish control is going to make its way under Syrian control. Because my initial thoughts when I heard that they were going to redeploy troops to the oil fields, I thought they were going to redeploy them into like this um, eastern section of Syria, about the middle, again near the government Kurdish border. But no,
Mhm.
they redeployed near the Turkish Kurdish controlled border, and again you can see the on the map the blue oil fields. So that's actually a bit of a surprise. Now, a lot of people on our side, a lot of news sources I follow, have rightly so criticized Trump and the U.S. for occupying Syrian oil and taking Syrian oil. But at the end of the day, they aren't in the most oil-rich fields. The Kurds still control, and as we know, negotiations have been going decently between the Syrian government and the Kurds. And at this rate, I don't want to speak too soon, but it looks like Syria might get most of its oil back.
Yeah, I think there's a great possibility for that. Of course, Syria can manage without it, but it's taxing them, and it's taxing both Iran and Russia. It would be preferable if, of course, if they got full control of the oil fields. Um, but I think that's a distinct possibility. I knew when it was announced that Turkey would be going in, that there were a few fields that the Syrians had already retaken. But now that you hear more of that, it looks like, because of course the justification is that America is there to stop ISIS from taking the oil. Well, I mean, most of the ISIS members in that area are in prisons. There wasn't this great escape of ISIS members who jumped in their Toyota trucks and took over the oil fields again. It's
Yeah, I mean,
it's not a,
a
it's
lot are
not
in
a story
prisons.
that's believable
Yeah,
for more than a month.
I mean, it would make more sense since a lot of the ISIS fighters in northeastern Syria are either imprisoned or defected to one of the Turkish-backed groups. It would make sense they said, we don't want Turks to control the oil. We don't want Turkish-backed militias to control the oil. Well, it would still be very easy to see through, but it would hold a little more weight than what they're telling us now.
Right. Right. And I also think, there was an article in the Independent about, uh, coming to terms. And this is, somebody who still thinks that Assad has to go. Um, that, the article basically mentioned that, the Western public was lied to. There weren't 70,000 freedom fighters who were, democratically minded and willing to risk their lives. There were probably like 7,000. And the jihadists were already in place in 2012, even in Damascus. And so basically, you know, the West is deflated over Syria, and that the suspicions all along that were popular in 2013, 14, 15, and 16 that these are actually just jihadists. And now you see Western media able to admit this. And in a sense, that can only be admitted now because there's no cost in admitting it.
I imagine you'll be able to relate to what I'm about to say right now. I have
Mm-hmm.
spent the last 3 years on YouTube, on Twitter, on various social media sites, on even in my real life, not as much though. Being told I'm
Yeah,
pushing Russian propaganda when I say the Syrian rebels are no different than Al Qaeda, and now they come out and say the exact same thing we've been saying for the past three and a
yeah,
half, 4 years.
yes, yeah. So it's kind of it's kind of like the world catching up with Alex Jones. Alex Jones went off about Epstein for years and
Oh,
years.
and we'll get into that.
Um, and I mean, nobody wants to admit it. I mean, especially with either the intelligentsia or the mainstream media or whatever pundit you might be thinking of, nobody wants to mention him. But the truth is, he was right about it. Whatever one might think about Alex Jones.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in a world where InfoWars and RT are the reliable news sources. Just, I mean,
Yeah.
and again, not by much, but compared to a CNN and MSNBC, a Fox News, and this is what we're relying on now. Since you brought it up, I considered striking out of the show, but the Epstein issue, of course, there were leaked tapes from ABC with one of the reporters saying, "Oh yeah, in 2016 we had a story completely ready on Epstein, but we got told to pull it because the royal family put pressure on us, and we were afraid we couldn't get interviews with them. We were afraid that they would come after us legally." And of course, it's no secret that the Epstein thing has been well known among the political elite, even among some of the normal people who are more in tune, pay attention for decades now. They know that
Yeah.
this guy who became a billionaire conspicuously has ties to several intelligence agencies, not just the Mossad. People really like to, of course, focus on his Mossad ties. I'd say completely justified, but CIA, MI6, you name it. Running this island, this molestation island, is probably the cleanest language I can put it in.
Yeah.
And inviting some of the most prominent people in the world here, whether it be American politicians, British politicians, Israeli politicians, the royal family. Funny enough, actually, no politicians, uh, east of the Danube, but that's aside the point. Um, you have this pretty much open secret amongst, of course, the political class and amongst the plebeians. And
Right. I mean, go ahead.
all of a sudden, it comes out now. Now, one of the things that also really gets me about this is beyond that, it's become a popular meme after the one coroner appeared on Fox News and said, "Oh yeah, his autopsy looks like more like a homicide than a suicide." So of course the Epstein didn't kill himself thing has been spraying around even amongst regular celebrities, even amongst just your normal everyday people. Now there was a lot of skepticism even among the people who don't pay attention when this first happened. Now whether what their political bias be like, oh Trump did it, oh Clinton did it, which were the probably the main two among your average American, they probably didn't buy into the official story and thought like, oh, they're covering up the Republican rapists or they're covering up the Democratic rapists. But point being is, their instincts were still in the right place. Now,
Mhm.
it's become popular. It's become acceptable to say Epstein didn't kill himself. Like, I don't think, again, I don't think YouTube would even take any issue with this because it's just become so mainstreamed. Now, if I want to look a little bit more into this, possibly than I should, I want to say, okay, maybe they've cut their losses. Maybe they're saying, okay, let them believe it. It's already out there. We'll take the L this time. But I want to say it's
Mhm.
to distract from someone like Ghislaine Maxwell, his former lover, and of course tied to her father, who worked for Israeli intelligence, had ties to Russia intelligence, American intelligence. The stereotypical Bond villain is pretty much what Robert Maxwell was, and of course, he had a very mysterious death himself about a decade ago. We won't get too much into that,
Yeah.
but uh, you have it here, and nobody's talked about her. I mean, beyond a few cases, beyond of course people in our circles, nobody's talked about Ghislaine Maxwell and how much of an integral role she actually played in this. How like she helped lure in a lot of the young girls they used, of course, on this honeypot island. But lo and behold, again, we can talk day in day out about Epstein, but about any of the people he was associated with, about Les Wexner, of course, his only client through the shell company they set up, of course, about any of these things, of course. Actually, Air America, the drug smuggling front we used during the Vietnam War and during the, of course, secret war in Laos and Cambodia, that we used to smuggle drugs to fund all these different militant groups in that part of the world, they are tied to this in a peripheral way. And again, it all comes back to the same source, which I think you all know what it is. I won't get too much into it, but yeah, I think they've mainstreamed the most surface level questioning of this and say, okay, this is acceptable. You can say this all you want, so people won't dig even deeper. Because even like I knew most of us knew as soon as the reports came out that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide, we knew it was completely bunk. We knew it was completely false. And immediately afterwards, we started asking, okay, who did it? Why did they do it? Who was Epstein associated with? What did they have to know? Because of course we can't hear it straight out of the horse's mouth because the horse has been butchered and sent to the glue factory. But what's the next best thing? People thought, okay, Ghislaine Maxwell, Ehud Barak, Clinton, Trump, blah 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 blah, whatever his top clients, in a general sense. But point being is, people aren't going to ask those questions now because it's become mainline, it's become mainstream, and they're content with saying, "Oh, Epstein didn't kill himself." Of course, their political bias is going to decide who killed him, whether it be Clinton, Trump, the CIA, Mossad, KGB. Of course, if you listen to um, that one chucklehead on MSNBC, Morning Joe, that's the one, of course. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, people are just going to assign their own personal biases to it, and they're going to forget about it. Now, hopefully, we don't do the same. I plan on covering every piece of newsworthy material that comes out of the story, but I figured it was worth bringing up.
Oh no, it is. I mean, I think in a sense the real story has already come and gone, and that is that this story was nixed back in 2016, and that was the election year. I think the perception was with media executives that although they could prove Trump had connections with him, that connections with Bill and the frequency with which Bill met him were so much in his favor that they could not maintain that Trump, the pussy grabber, they would have no gainsay. It would tarnish Hillary's chances as well, and I think that is the main reason why the story was killed.
Yeah, and not only did Bill Clinton have, of course, quite the connection to Epstein, but it's not just guilt by association. Hillary Clinton had quite the connections, quite the relationship with him as well.
Right, right. I mean, she was probably molesting those girls as much as her husband was. So.
Yeah, just to bring back, I know we met. You may have seen our episode a few months ago. Yeah, we had Ryan Dawson on it, and he subscribes to that theory, and I'd say he's more or less a reliable source. Disagree on a few things, of course, but
Yeah.
I think he's probably on the mark there. Now, moving on from that, a little bit more news on the home front. On now, this is probably one of the most gruesome stories I think I'll have to talk about on the show. I don't think I brought it up to you before because
Mhm.
I sort of thought it. But of course, the event in Mexico, I believe it was three families with 9 people killed in total, uh, including of course children, were murdered by the cartels. Now, of course, the mainstream media response to this was, "Oh well, they were actually religious missionaries who have a long history of colonialism in Mexico." Just minus the fact that they're dual U.S. Mexican citizens, minus the fact that they're actually of at least partial Mexican heritage, not like they're just some white Anglo-Saxon family that showed up in Mexico anyway. Not that would make it okay, but sort of refuting their own narrative within the story. But whatever. Now, this has led to a lot of outrage even among Trump, and Trump actually suggested something that we've said on the show. Now, he said, "Oh, we may have to go to war with the Mexican cartels." And look, that's something I tongue in cheek advocated for, at least some sort of military action against them. But I was listening to Tucker Carlson's interview with Douglas McGregor last night to bring him up, get the all the necessary you know references into the show. And what he said was, "Look, that sounds great on paper. It sounds great to use our military force against a group actually threatening us." But he brought up the question, okay, what's the end goal? What do we consider the destruction of the cartel? It's going to end up exactly like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, where it's always just this one last cell of them left. It's always just this one last leader left that we have to get. And it goes on in perpetuity because that's how the United States fights wars. Um,
Mhm.
Now, his suggestion was, which I completely agree with, pretty much we go in and clear out anyone who's a main threat. And then we completely lock down the border. We completely shut it down. He said 40 to 50,000 regular army troops on the border, not just National Guard, not just reservists, not just any of these other secondary groups, but actual active duty frontline combat troops should be put on the U.S. Mexico border. There should be a complete lockdown. And one of his big concerns about actual military intervention against cartels is reprisals because of how embedded they are in the United States in major urban areas. Let's say we firebomb a uh, drug production plant for the cartels. Who says they won't shoot up somewhere in L.A. or Miami or any of the other major urban areas they're concentrated in? I mean, of course they cooperate. The Sinaloa cartel is not just confined to Mexico. The Sinaloa cartel is far from the only one doing this. Even though I believe it was actually the Sinaloa cartel groups linked with them who committed the massacre a few days ago earlier this week. But it does point out, especially with the story we had about El Chapo and his son being busted out by the cartels, with very with pretty much no blood spilled, with the Mexican forces standing down and allowing them calling off several other raids. I think what this will ultimately amount to is Trump will campaign on we're gonna knock the hell out of the cartels. They'll bring up like the we're gonna knock the hell out of ISIS thing he did in 2015, 2016. But ultimately, he may drop a few bombs on them. He may take some retaliatory measure against them. There's not going to be much military action for the exact reason that, again, there will probably be reprisals if that is the case. And I would like to think that he would use this as an opportunity to shut down the border. He may, but even if he does put his whole heart into saying, look, it's a national security crisis, it's an emergency, we need a shutdown of the border, nothing gets in or out without us knowing, without the army knowing. I don't think he's going to be able to get through. I think the court or Congress or somebody will come in and obstruct it. Now, we may get more border security than what we currently have, but I don't think we're going to get the full lockdown with 50,000 troops like Colonel McGregor suggested.
Right. I think Trump is going to use this to his advantage. I mean, if you want to get Trump's base fired up and switch from what basically, since the Tea Party years has been non-interventionist, almost pacifist, and a desire to, a very strong desire to focus strictly, on internal American matters. If you want to get that base fired up for like a war, for a conflict, just all Trump has to do is say we're going to go after the cartels. I mean, they would be ecstatic. So I agree with you. I think he this is an opportunity. He can use this. Um, he can flip it. I don't really think at bottom that, like, I mean, the headlines are pathetic, coming from especially the New York Times. Did you know that Mexico has had a problem with religious fundamentalists in Mexico? No, because it's not a big deal. Like, it's a big deal to you because your perspective is whacked. I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean,
even from Mexicans, it's not a problem. Mexicans have bigger issues than offensive gringos who have weird, heretical forms of Christianity as a belief system.
yeah, I doubt the main concern of your average Mexican is the fact that some polygamists set up a compound in the middle of the desert.
Right. Mexicans are not converting to Mormonism. Okay. Like,
I mean,
and these people are not the Branch Davidians. Like, but of course they had to spin it that way. They had to use, college level woke mindset to come up with these titles. And I mean, and they've been ratioed on Twitter too.
yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean,
they've been ridiculed.
you would
So,
think that white ISIS is operating in the deserts of Mexico, and it's all a lot better when you consider the fact that about a year and a half ago, there was that terrorist training compound in New Mexico that allegedly had ties to ISIS, but was clearly Islamic, at least Islamic inspired terrorism training camp. Of course, that really got swept under the rug, but the point stands. Now,
mhm.
yeah, I this will definitely be red meat to Trump's base. He can rile them up. He can, of course, throw his symbolic missiles at any cartel targets or take some action against them. But the thing is, again, maybe it's because I put a lot of stock in what he says. I'm inclined to defer what McGregor says and think, yeah, any substantial military action we take is going to be just another pit like it is in the Middle East. And what we need to do is we need to be strictly on the defensive on the border. Now, of course, I'm no military expert. I haven't been in the army for 40 years and studied at some of the most prestigious war colleges in the world, but I disagree with the colonel, and I do think we probably should invade Mexico at least into a um, demilitarized zone, invade into their territory, and set up the defenses there. I mean, it's not like the Mexican government's going to be able to react too much. And it's not like they're. I don't think your average Mexican would care if we invaded that desert area along the border where practically nobody lives. Maybe it's not the best idea, but I think we need to create a little bit of a buffer zone if we're going to completely shut things down.
Hmm.
No, not that it's going to happen, but if we were to go about it, that's probably would make the most sense.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I hope he doesn't. I hope he doesn't uh, ignore the possibility this has for him politically speaking. Because that would be incredible. And the kind of resentment from elitists will be delicious.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
yeah, so I'm hoping that he does, and frankly, all things aside, he should. Um, I mean, I could even imagine Obama doing something about this.
Oh yeah, I think political pressure is so much. If not the federal government, I mean, you think about it. Arizona's a red state, Texas red state. I think a lot of these border states will mobilize their national guards. And look, there's already national guard troops on the border, but I could see the governor of Texas saying, "Look, this is unacceptable. We're securing at least the Texas border."
Yeah.
Now, seeing as there is the impending Mexico Civil War, at least the um, impending massive cartel wars that involve the government and several militia groups in Mexico, I have a feeling this probably won't be the last we see of this. Unfortunately, I think even if it's not American citizens, I think we'll probably see many more brutal massacres, which I think will only increase public pressure on the government, even amongst moderates, even amongst some liberals. Some liberals will give up on their principles of tolerance and diversity and loose immigration. We need to invite the entire world in with open arms. I think you'll see even them start to say, maybe we need to do something about the border. Maybe we need some sort of security. Now, as bloody and brutal as it is, if Trump plays it right, it's a political victory.
Yes. Absolutely.
And I think this might be the one thing that actually gives it to him, where he can really shove this in the face of detraction and say, you Ninth Circuit Court, you want to shut this down? Do you want more Americans to die at the hands of Mexican drug cartels?" He can really play this. And look, I've had my doubts about Trump. I've had my heavy criticisms of Trump. But I think even with the more moderate elements, the more subversive elements in his administration, I still think he might be able to pull it off. Again, I don't think we'll get the full militarized border, the full shutdown of any flow, regardless of like anything. I don't think we're going to get the DMZ on the U.S. Mexican border, if you will. But I do think
Hmm.
we'll get something a lot better than what we have now.
Yeah. Yeah, it remains to be seen. Hopefully, it'll happen. I would like to. Um, yeah, that's all I have to say.
Now we got a few more topics before we closed out, mainly some Europe news. Now, this will be a brief topic. The official British election campaign started. Corbyn was giving his speech, Boris Johnson was giving his speech, and things are on the road. And of course, the Liberal Democrats actually had a pretty interesting flyer campaign where they had a very um, unflattering caricature of both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn sitting across the table, while like the Liberal Democrats just standing in the middle, being the good moderate centrist, saying, "Oh, we'll lead the country into prosperity." On like these two extremes, really playing up that enlightened centrist take, which I don't know, just doesn't seem like a good move in the current Western political climate. But I digress. I haven't heard much out of Farage or the Brexit Party or what's left of UKIP or any of these other populist parties. Again, I think it's going to boil down to Boris Johnson versus Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think third parties are going to play much of a role in this election. I mean, the Brexit Party, Farage already said that we're only running in districts where we're sure we can win. We're not going to rob votes from the Conservative Party. Now, the polls put the Conservatives, of course, at a slight advantage over the Liberals, but well, again, we'll see as time goes on, as the next month and couple days pass, how that changes. Admittedly, I think Corbyn is a weak candidate for both fair reasons and unfair reasons with the media campaign against him, the so-called anti-Semitism, bigotry of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. Not that Boris Johnson is much better. He's sort of viewed as a British Trump in terms of mannerisms and even appearance. So I imagine the left wing in the UK will play that up, saying like, "Oh, we don't want our own Trump. We can't be like those rubish Americans. We need a strong, sophisticated leader." Now, I imagine that rhetoric will probably come more from the Lib Dems, but that's aside the point. But it'll definitely be interesting to see, keep an eye on what's going on in the UK, and I'm curious to see the French reaction to the next election, which leads us into the topic we have next. Now, of course, France has been making its maneuvers. They were in China, of course, with China and EU flag showing that France does not only Macron does not only want to represent the French nation, but the entirety of the European Union when it comes to foreign diplomacy. Now, that's a bit of a small story, but he's been definitely making a lot of moves in the past few weeks. And you want to get a little bit into that?
Yeah, so Macron, as you say, has been making a lot of news lately, and we're talking in the last few weeks. As you know, he had an interview on what mainstream French media would term right wing, which is basically centrist. But uh, you know, uh, so he did have an interview with the right wing magazine that some condemned him for. Furthermore, he has come out and said that he has a new immigration policy that will deny free healthcare to economic migrants, uh, people who illegally enter into the country. And today, he has made a statement a month before NATO's meetings that are about to take place that um, NATO is brain dead. Uh, he's basically he extrapolated that America's unwillingness or America's incoherence in NATO has left like a brain drain or I mean, I personally think he's saying this in order to attract a lot of attention. He has sort of positioned himself, as unpopular as he is with many sides in France, as kind of the de facto EU leader. Merkel has really receded into the background. And, let's not forget that he and Merkel, and him more than Merkel, has suggested a European army, something other than NATO, which, of course, is basically an American outfit. 75% of it is American, anyways. Um, I think this is a really, really interesting development because after World War II, I think for a lot of Europeans, of course, it's not just the Balkans or some countries in the Balkans that dislike NATO and so on. NATO has been disliked for a long time by major European countries with their populations in Germany, Britain, France, what have you. So I think that's the dialectic that we have between America and Russia, and a desire for Europe not to be squashed and not to be sidelined. Notice that also Macron is having talks with China. And this is also so that Europe is not isolated with whatever agreements Trump may achieve with China. He is also looking forward to improving ties with Russia. I think he sees how crucial, I think he sees there is no path forward for a different kind of Europe, a more independent and robust Europe, without cooperation with Russia. I think he absolutely recognizes that. I think he knows that the EU is in a weak position, and whether we say that he's making the most of it, or whether he's creating the possibility of a more positive future for the EU and for Europe at large, is maybe still up to debate. I'm pessimistic, but uh, and of course I understand that he is a an ambitious man. So um, he sees, I think, a vacancy within the within the EU for leadership, and he's taking advantage of it. So yeah, I would say continue to pay close attention to Macron. You have him meeting with China. You have him saying things that uh, Belgium and the U.S. and Britain are not happy about. About uh, setting off on a positive path with Russia. Merkel certainly was very disappointed. She considered the language alarmist and extremist that to declare that NATO is brain dead. But that's a very interesting choice of words to say that it's brain dead. I think he's basically saying that it doesn't have a vision of the future and what its purpose is. He wants to retool it and repurpose it in a different way because again, this sort of necessity for Europe to find third position, if it is to survive, requires a retooling of NATO or something like NATO. Um, because if it doesn't achieve this independence, it will be in a worse state.
Now, as you said, Macron is sort of offering the third position, the third way, if you will. Now,
Yeah.
contrast that to the Anglo-American. We must confront Russia. Russia must be brought to heel, and they are a geopolitical rival. No ifs and or buts about it. Even with someone like Trump in the White House, even with someone like Trump who says, "Oh, there's no reason we shouldn't get along with Russia. There's no reason NATO needs to exist in the form it is today." Now, of course, actions speak louder than words, and Trump's actions haven't reflected his words. You have the European populace, specifically in countries like Italy, like Hungary, and even someone in France like Le Pen, who say, "Oh, there's no reason we can't have good diplomatic relations with Russia," except the difference between them and Trump is they actually live that out. Even with the more left wing government in power in Italy, they're still leaning towards Russia, leaning towards even China for that matter, especially Orban meeting with Putin on a regular basis. There's a few other more populistic European countries that have leaned more towards Russia, where you have Macron coming out and saying, "Look, I am a fellow disaffected European liberal. The United States has abandoned us. They have failed to fulfill their role. Turn to me. I can help you. I can build up a third way. We don't have to play nice to the Russians. We can still confront them. We're not going to suicidally do it like the Anglos and Americans want to, but we're not going to
Mhm.
cozy up to them like those Eastern Europeans and Italians are going to." So his position has a broad appeal, I would say, in Western European countries, in of course France, in Germany, in the Nordic states, and Spain, Portugal. I would say he probably hit that right consensus with them, where like, oh yeah, we'll talk to the Russians, we'll hold diplomacy, but oh no, no, we're not going to play nice with them like they do in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. We're going to stay strong, but we're not going to do it suicidally as the Americans want to.
Right. I mean, Norway, for instance, has signed on with Nord Stream. Nord Stream is nearly complete. I don't hear the grumblings of U.S. Sanctions on German companies and any other company, even American, if they complete the project. If somebody has news about that, please let us know. But I haven't heard anything. So Nord Stream is a go. I think basically Macron is a pragmatist, and he sees what is probably necessary for Europe, and I think you pointed out something very subtle and very important, that this distinction of him not being like other Eastern European countries or like say, Italy or some southern European countries. Uh, of course, to keep this kind of unity within Europe intact, his position can't be as cozy as that. After all, he has to work this third way in order to achieve some level of independence. Um, you know, Europe has, if we're to believe that America is, in a very slow way receding its outward growth or influence, then it makes perfect sense that Europe will have to pick up the slack. They'll have to fill in that void.
Oh yeah. Now, also in Macron's moves, which we mentioned last week, he denied entry into the European Union to Albania and North Macedonia. Now, following that, the Balkans, of course, has been targeted the European Union ever since the 2000s for integration. Same with Ukraine. Well, we must integrate them into the European Union and NATO. They must become part of the West. Now, of course, we've seen with how it's been so far, at least within NATO, they've been more of a burden than anything. Now that Macron recognized that and he turned down the applications of these two poor Balkan states, one better off Balkan state has reached out to Russia. Now, of course, to nobody's surprise, this is Serbia, and they're considering an arms deal with Russia to purchase the S-400. Now, of course, this should come as no surprise to anyone, and it's beyond a consideration. They're set to buy it. Just the formalities have to be done, the contracts have to be signed, but it looks like they're doing a pretty heavy arms deal with Russia. They're buying also the Pantsir, which is more the short range missile, but same technology. Now, it's
Yeah.
expected to be delivered in the next few months after the signing of the contract. Now, this is despite the U.S. saying we're sanctioning countries that buy Russian anti-air systems. Now, it's not like Serbia it has much concern for U.S. sanctions. It's not like it's something they're not used to. It's not like they're jeopardizing a partnership with the United States. Even to the degree you could say Turkey was. I would say Turkey was rolling the dice when they bought the S-400, considering the relatively good relationship they have with the United States. And of course, that's all but evaporated. But it's not like Serbia had much to lose in terms of the relationship with the U.S. and the West.
Right. We discussed that. It's a possibility that either it, maybe it was intentional, maybe it wasn't, but in a sense, Serbia's sort of half reluctance and half enthusiasm to engage with the EU. Of course, I mean, it sits on certain boards as well, so it does have one foot in the EU. Was a way to maintain it from being isolated, because the possibility of its isolation, of course, or even greater isolation, of course, is very high ever since the Balkan Wars in the 90s in the early part of the 2000s. So um, I think they've played this right, and I think they're taking the cue from Turkey, as are other countries, including India, buying Russian-made anti-air defense systems. Um, it's I mean, I don't, I think no one really cares right now if America is going to sanction them. Uh, Countries are making this decision. They're going to live with the sanctions. Because frankly, not being under America's sanctions isn't better.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, and especially again with Macron's softer stance in the Balkans, I think Serbia feels safe at this point where they don't have to straddle the line in order to avoid a color revolution, as we saw in Ukraine. Of course, under Yanukovych, Ukraine was solidly in the Russian sphere. No ifs and buts about it. That they were going to side with the Russians, and of course, that ended with Yanukovych being forced into exile.
Right, and of course, I think Macron made a great decision not allowing Albania and Macedonia in. The EU is really not in any position. I mean, unless you're an American and you see Europe as like part of your chessboard and Russia is the opponent, or maybe you're Britain and you empathize with the American position as well. there's no point in including any more countries in the EU right now. What's Macedonia's real, GDP? What's Albania's? These are, I mean, I'm Macedonian myself. These countries do not have strong economies. There's not that much they can offer,
I mean,
right?
it'd be like letting Moldova in, and Moldova's. I mean, I think Ukraine has actually surpassed it since the revolution, but Moldova was the poorest country in Europe, and
Yeah,
barring any unification with Romania, they're definitely not getting into the EU.
right. And so it makes no sense. Again, America is a great example of this federation that became centralized, and it went very deep first, and then it expanded. Uh, but it's that the first 50, 60 years from around the time of the American Revolution that it strongly, it solidifies itself. It goes through a civil war, and after that, it begins an expansion process, and that goes on until roughly World War One. And like people are under a great illusion, thinking that Europe is the same. The parts of Europe are far more distinct, and they have very different histories, different traditions. They're similar and bound in many ways, and in other ways they are different. You can't just go wide without going deep. And so, I mean, I don't even like the EU and NATO, but I'm saying, if I was a strategist for them, I would say that this was a good move.
Yeah, and
Um,
this is going to be very reductionist, but I'm going to do it for the sake of the transition. It's a group of very disparate countries being held together by having their economies be held hostage by Germany.
yeah.
Now, with that, Deutsche Bank, for the second and third quarter of 2019, has lost nearly 4 billion euros. Now, of course, this comes from Zero Hedge, and quite the response came from it. So Zero Hedge, of course, they'll tweet out anything from the most mainstream media to the most fringe media. So uh, what happened was, let me read the exact headline of the article on Twitter. Now, Zero Hedge puts out the Deutsche Bank death watch has taken a very interesting turn. Now, the official Deutsche Bank account replies to that this is utterly nonsense. So they are in full damage control. They've probably given their PR department full reign to dispel any notions of the fact that the bank may be falling on hard times. Now, we discussed this back in, I believe it was August, that this story came up that Deutsche Bank was taking heavy losses. And those losses have continued into the third quarter, which of course just ended in October. And one thing that might actually put a wrench into Macron's plan for this, for this restructuring of Europe, it could be another recession. If another recession hits, especially in Germany, that is really
Mhm.
going to screw over not only the entire European Union, but Macron's vision for looking forward because he's building all these new apparatus, if you will. He's making all these inroads. Well, you know what's going to make that fall apart? If the economy goes down the toilet.
Right, and Germany's economy has been slowing down. I mean, this has been reported for the better part of this year. Um, it's We even spoke about this regarding Germany's exports of manufacturing tools and robots and what have you to Asia. So
Yeah, and
there
their
is a
desperation to make a
slowdown.
deal with Russia over oil and gas, you could attribute to their economic stalling.
Yeah. So, again, very wise move not to tag along any more dependents.
Yeah, I mean, I joked a couple weeks back that if they admitted Ukraine, it could be the undoing. Now, as small as they are,
Very true.
any of these Balkan states could actually be the straw that breaks the camel's back and could trigger even just a small recession, which of course could be something they get over in a year or two, or could snowball into something worse. And I think, again, at least from the political calculations someone like Macron has made, it's not a risk worth taking.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah, no, certainly not. Yeah, go ahead.
uh, no, go ahead. I was just gonna close out with this story about Russia, unless you have more to say about this.
No, I don't actually. I'm good.
So, of course, as the end of the year rolls around, you get all the economic projections for the coming year and how things are going to tally up at the end of this year. And many analysts are saying Russia's economy isn't poised to have much growth. I think they're predicting 1%, which, look, given the rift that's growing between Russia and the West, given a lot of the uh, post Cold War progress between the U.S. and Russia has been undone over the past couple years, late Obama, early Trump years. Russia still, again, they've been making these deals with Germany. They've Nord Stream, Turk Stream, making inroads in Italy last year, that signing an extensive trade deal. Of course, their increased cooperation with China and other East Asian partners. It doesn't add up
Right.
to me the fact that they would have such little economic growth after all these moves over this past year.
Yes. It is an issue, but I think we should also mention a few other things about the Russian economy, just to put things into perspective. So, if you go back to 2013, the Russian economy began to stagnate, and but it was more or less quickly alleviated by the time 2015 rolled around. And by the time 2017 and 18 rolled around, of course, they had higher than expected growth. 2017 being basically the best year. Um, they're not projecting huge growth, further down the road. A lot of the boom years, from 2000 to 2008, in the 90s, Russians were literally paying Western oil companies they were literally paying them to come over and extract oil. Well, I mean, Putin changed that very quickly. Um,
Sort of the Iraq War, but point stands.
right. So, um, but just to put into perspective, for instance, in those boom years, oil, gas, what have you, oil prices, let's say Russian oil prices, they would have had to have sold for $115 for the budget to break even. Well, of course, we haven't seen oil prices like that in basically almost a decade. However, at the moment, um, all that oil prices have to be is at $43 in order for Russia to break even. So they're still managing. Um, Russia's economy also has very little debt. It doesn't function quite the same way as a Western economy. Sometimes other metrics like, you know, compare smartphones and who had them in 2007 in Russia compared to 2019, for instance. Uh, Compare mortgages. Are Russians getting more mortgages? And they are. I don't want to belittle, that the growth has been slow, and generally speaking, Putin, the economy right now is basically where, I mean, it's functioning better, but I'm saying the stagnation is at a point where it's more similar to 1998 or 2008. Um, I don't know all the reasons why that is. I think Putin is working pretty hard to try to get foreign investment into the country. And, uh, you know, other things have improved. For instance, the gray market that was so prevalent in Yeltsin's time, it's still there, but it's at a much lower degree. Taxation reforms are now much better than they were, even in the 2000s. So the diversification is going to be like the number one thing necessary for Russians. They lead, in some respects, in some areas, but they're niche areas. Um, so they, I think, have the highest in agricultural tools and machinery. This would include tractors, but that's not the same thing as, say, having an automobile. And again, a lot of countries don't produce their own automobiles. Norway doesn't.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, U.S., Japan, Germany, and a couple others are they make the vast majority of automobiles in the world.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's still capital flight, but it's not at the level that it was back then. Um, you know, the economic downturn that occurred in 2008 affected Russia quite a bit. They were very much on a roll, and that hurt them tremendously. And so there's been a bouncing back. Of course, 2013 and 14, when the war in Ukraine broke out, Crimea, and so on. Uh, that also slowed down the economy, but they have managed to um, overcome some of these obstacles. So it's a bit topsy turvy, but I think that they're expecting by for instance, oil revenues, they're expecting by 2023 that they'll reach the 2.0 or 1.8 trillion that they were enjoying prior to 2008. So, um, we shall see. The there's also like, you know, there's some grumblings. I've noticed on some programs that, yeah, Putin was great. He brought us out of this, but like we need to keep going forward. And some of the policies that he introduced did, on average, absolutely work. Everything from the way the central bank was managed to the way taxation was managed, and so on, has been positive. However, I think there is a sense that the economy is stagnating, that it's not advancing as fast as most people would like.
Now,
Um,
I'm glad you brought that up. Well, first off, I just want to say I realized that I left the Syria map on for most of the show, so I hope that's not too bothersome, even on when we talk about different topics. But I want to say that I'm glad you brought up that, yeah, a lot of people in Russia will admit Putin did drag us out of ruin. He did stabilize the country. Now, one thing I will also give him credit for is during the boom years, he did plan for the bust years. He knew that they were coming. He wasn't like a lot of these states, like, for example, Saudi Arabia, that think, oh, this oil high is going to last forever and we're just going to be rich forever. And then oil prices go down and their economy is under extreme strain. Putin, again, maybe not perfectly, but he at least had the foresight to see that, yeah, we better be making plans for this, or we better be making plans for any of these other various events. Now, a lot of people in the West like to talk up, well, Putin's becoming unpopular in Russia. Look, the Russian people don't like him anymore. And of course, they'll point to people like Navalny and a lot of these other liberal puppets they have there saying they're going to free Russia from the tyranny of Vladimir Putin. A lot of the opposition to Putin isn't necessarily because of, oh, he's an evil KGB murderer who likes to oppress his people. It's exactly what you said. It's like, okay, that's great. He brought us to this point, but are we going to go any further than this, or are we just going to stay in this period of stagnation, sort of decent living standards, but not as good as the West for until the end of time?
mhm.
They want something more than that. So a lot of the opposition to Putin is still arguably just as illiberal, but they want someone who has an even greater vision for the future. Now, all things considered, I think Putin has a decent vision for the future, but again, appealing to the masses is difficult. You can't exactly lay out your exact plan. Number one, because a lot of people won't understand it. Number two, you don't show your hand to your enemies. If we said that, of course, like every country in the world would be like, okay, Russia's going to do this, this, and this, so we have to do this, this, and this. So again, I think Putin has been a good leader. Definitely, there's no denying that. He's been a good statesman, been great on a diplomatic level for, I would say, most of the world, even including the United States. He's kept us out of quite a few wars, so I got to give him credit on that note. But I do think there are legitimate criticisms. Is the fact that I can see why a lot of people are thinking, yeah, he's not doing enough. Yeah, we want something new. When is he going to push forward? Now, granted, I think he's probably waiting for the right time to push forward, but I can definitely understand those frustrations from the Russian people.
Right. I mean, the the poverty level in Russia is on par with most Western societies. It's about 14.3%. In the 90s, if you use what the UN defined as $1.90 a day, um, millions and millions of Russians were in poverty. male fatality rate and suicide rate in the 90s exceeded that in the worst periods of Russia's communist era, and even the terror. So you can't overemphasize it. How and also in terms of attitudes, I mean, Russia is a very different kind of country. Um, the West has really, grown used to the whole salesman pitch, the whole rise of the mercantile class, and that's never really been a class within Russia. That was always a foreign class, and there's still an embarrassment about it. It is ultimately a different society, and but I'm certain they will find ways to, because their their drive, their insistence on keeping themselves, and they do have a kind of vision for their future that's not always about in fact it's never about the economy, but it's where they place themselves in the world. That's very much there with Russians. So there is a self belief there. It is very strong. Um, and we may see a Russia in 1 or 200 years that will adapt more of this kind of culture, but it's still a centralized economy and is working, sort of in its fourth stage after the Leninist model, but it's still at the moment it's still in transition, moving away from a centrally planned economy. And you know what? It may stay there. And you could argue that in some ways, China is succeeding with its central dominated economy, right? The central dominated economies don't always fail, but you can learn from the past.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
we don't know if it's really going to move into an economy like that of the West, or it will always be centrally planned. It really depends on several factors. Some of that is a gradual population decline. I mean, 2017 or maybe it was 2018 is when Russia had sort of been going up in terms of population replacement, but um, it did take a hit in 2018 where the birth rate fell, uh, below its trajectory below where it was hoping it would be, and that was the year that economically um, things were generally improving, that they exceeded some of their expectations, unlike what they expect for 2020.
yeah, I would say the biggest problem with Russia right now is they are on a series of steady inclines in a world that demands more rapid inclines.
Right.
Now,
Yes.
I will say to continue on what you said. I like how you brought up the centralized model versus like the more mercantile model, and a lot of course, like capitalists will say, "Oh, we need the free market, we need a market economy because that's the only thing that works." Your socialists say like, "We need that centralized economy, we need a planned economy because that's the only thing that works." With both of them failing to realize cultures are different, people are different, circumstances are different. Some countries like Russia, like China, need that more centralized model to succeed. Some countries in the West, like the UK and the Netherlands, especially a couple hundred years ago, were a good example where they needed that mercantile economy in order to succeed. People overlook these things, the fact that it depends on circumstance. That's why I think, just on a side note, basing your ideology on your economic beliefs is extremely stupid. I'll just come out and say it. But beyond that,
Right. Right. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
beyond,
Go ahead.
okay, yeah, beyond that, Russia's future, I think, more or less better if they can keep where they are, if they can keep stagnating. Look, we're coming into Putin's home stretch. He's going to be out of office. in the next 4 or 5 years upcoming. Now, I would say if I had to go with my gut instinct, someone like Lavrov or one of the somebody from that wing of his inner circle will succeed him. Somebody who can carry on his vision and maybe even take it a little further now that him as a figure is out of office and how circumstances change. So I think what we really need to look at, because so far, okay, it's been 20 years. Putin has proved that come hell or high water, he's able to keep Russia just barely afloat if in the worst case scenario. He can keep them in a decent place for over the past 20 years or so. He's kept them alive, and he's kept them on life support at the very worst. Again, they've never sunk, they've never drowned under him. Now, I think he'll be able.
Right, and
He'll be.
we
He'll.
shouldn't forget that he made great, huge military reforms beginning in like 2011, 2012. Um, and this was, already after 2008, which had affected them greatly. There are some Russians who were very upset by that they felt that was the wrong move, that he should have invested even more into his reforms and so on instead of do that. But, it could be argued that he was, intelligence was telling him what would eventually happen in Ukraine. Um, so, you know, home economies are inextricably tied to geopolitics, especially if they're big players. The bigger the country, the more that geopolitics plays a role in domestic economy.
Yeah, that's a given. But I will say this in closing: Putin has proven himself he'll be able to keep Russia's head above the water for at least the next 4 years. Now, who comes after him is what's going to make or break this country, because there's only two options that I can see. There's going to be Medvedev, or somebody similar to him, who won't willingly be a Yeltsin type figure, but just because of their lack of wherewithal, will be forced into becoming a Yeltsin like figure. You can get a Shoigu type who is way too much of a Cold Warrior, way too hawkish on the West, who may drive Russia into ruin just because of their militarism. Or, again, I think this is the most likely, you're going to get someone like a Lavrov who continues what Putin is doing, but will have the political capital being a fresh face to push it forward.
And it would be another Georgian leading the country.
Yeah.
Georgians have done pretty good.
Couple million buys aside, but you can't make it out without breaking some eggs, okay?
Yeah.
Look. Some unpleasant things have to be done, but it's all in the name of progress. Yeah, but yeah, unless I will say this, I expect a Lavrov to come in power, but if the new Cold War picks up in the next 4 years, I could actually see someone like Shoigu coming to power and bringing it into like full Cold Warrior mode. But again, time will tell, and that probably won't happen. But that's all I have to say for this week.
Yeah, I mean, all I would add to that is let's see what happens in 2020 because, um, you know, Macron is talking like Brexit is still going to happen. So who knows? Is he bluffing? Is it going to happen? That's going to really change the chessboard quite a bit. So yeah, that's all I would have to add.
Yeah, and if a particularly hawkish Democrat gets in, that could change things. Like again, like I honestly, I think Buttigieg, out of all the nominees that have the chance of actually becoming president, would actually be the most hawkish. And, Biden too old. Warren has to pander to that progressive crowd. Bernie, I think, is probably genuinely an anti-interventionist, despite some of his less appealing ideas, which I won't get into. But again, I could actually see like the young gay man wanting to preserve the gay neoliberal empire. What is prize? What is prize? But beyond that, again, yeah, 2020 will be pivotal with Brexit in the U.S. election, especially for the
Yeah.
direction of Russia. But with that, I think that's all I have for this week.
Yep, that's same with me.
So thank you for everyone tuning into this episode of the War Report, which went on much longer than I expected, but no problem with that, of course. We will see you guys next week, and goodbye.